Night settles gently around you now, as though a curtain has been drawn across the day. If you wish, let your breathing slow, unhurried, like footsteps on an old stone street after sunset. This story does not rush. It does not demand. It simply opens a door and invites you inside. We are going to walk through Germany, not all at once, not with the noise of dates or commands, but slowly, as time itself might walk if it were human. We will pass between then and now, allowing the two to speak quietly to one another. One does not shout over the other. They coexist, like overlapping echoes in a long corridor. Germany, in the years of the Second World War, was a land both ordinary and profoundly strained. It was still a place where bread was baked in the morning, where tram bells rang, where children memorized poems at school. Yet beneath those routines ran a deep, tightening current, a pressure that shaped every choice, every silence, every glance exchanged across a table. In the early 1930s, long before bombs fell, Germany was already tired. The memory of the First World War lingered like a chronic ache. Inflation had eaten away savings. Pride had been wounded, not only politically, but emotionally. Many Germans did not wake each morning thinking of ideology or conquest. They woke thinking of work, of rent, of how to keep a household standing upright in a world that felt increasingly unsteady. Into that weariness stepped certainty, loud, rhythmic, and confident. The rise of Adolf Hitler did not arrive as an explosion, but as a drumbeat. Order, renewal, strength. These words were repeated often enough to feel solid. For many, they sounded like relief. For others, like danger approaching in measured steps. Now imagine a small apartment in Berlin. Late evening, 1938. The radio hums softly. A kettle warms on the stove. Outside, boots pass on the pavement below, not hurried, but firm. Inside, a family sits close together, not necessarily in fear yet, but in awareness. Walls, once neutral, had begun to feel thin. Germany at war was not a single emotion. It was pride layered over anxiety, belief resting atop doubt, silence covering fear. A factory worker tightening the same bolt for the 1000th time might feel both useful and trapped. A mother packing a lunch might wonder what words not to say aloud. A soldier boarding a train might feel excitement, tangled with something colder, unnamed. As the war deepened, the land itself changed texture. Cities darkened at night, curtains drawn tight against air raid sirens. Trains ran heavy with freight and soldiers. Letters grew shorter. Food tasted different. Coal dust clung to coats. Time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably long waits, punctuated by moments of sudden terror. And yet, life continued. Eat, always, doze. There were still gardens tended in quiet corners. Still music played softly when allowed. Still moments small, private, where someone paused at a window and watched the sky, remembering what peace had once felt like. When we look at Germany now, the contrast is immense, but not abrupt. Modern Germany is orderly, measured, and deliberate in its movements through the world. Cities rebuilt not only with stone and steel, but with intention. Streets once reduced to rubble now carry bicycles, trams, and conversations in many languages. The air is lighter, though history has not been erased from it. The Germany of today walks carefully with its past. Memory is not hidden away. It is marked, studied, taught. Still pristine, small stones set into sidewalks quietly remind passers-by of lives interrupted. Museums do not glorify, they explain. Schools do not rush past the war, they linger thoughtfully. And yet, daily life is calm. Morning bakeries open with warm light spilling onto clean sidewalks. Offices hum softly. Trains run on time. Democracies practiced in ordinary, almost boring ways. Votes, debates, compromises. This is not weakness. It is a choice made repeatedly to live differently than before. The comparison between then and now is not a sharp line dividing good from evil, chaos from order. It is more like a river that has changed course over decades. To Sami land, the same climate, but guided carefully, intentionally. away from the cliffs it once rushed toward. As we continue, we will move deeper into homes, streets, classrooms, factories, and memories. We will listen to the quiet thoughts of people who lived through those years, and we will observe how their descendants move through the same spaces today, carrying knowledge rather than fear. For now, stay here a moment longer. Feel the weight of time slowing. The story has only begun to unfold, and Germany, both then and now, is still breathing softly in the dark, waiting to be understood a little more deeply as we go on. The night deepens, and with it the sense of listening rather than watching. Germany, during the war years, was a country learning how to whisper. After dusk, cities changed character. Lamps were dimmed or extinguished entirely. Windows were sealed with dark cloth. Even footsteps seemed to soften, as though sound itself might draw danger from the sky. In apartments, families learned new routines. Where to sit when sirens began, which stairwell felt safest, which neighbor would knock first. Air raid shelters became a second kind of home. Not comfortable, never welcoming, but familiar. Concrete walls, benches worn, smoothed by anxious hands. The smell of damp coats and fear mixed together. People brought small things with them. A book already read many times, a scarf, a child's toy, not because they helped, but because they reminded them who they were before all of this. Above ground, streets waited in darkness. Trams stood still. Shops closed early. Time slowed into long stretches of waiting punctured by sudden violence. And yet, even here, habits persisted. Someone always counted the seconds between sirens. Someone always tried to calm the children with the same story. Someone always believed the worst would not happen this time. In rural Germany, the war arrived differently, but no less completely. Farms continued to work the soil, though hands were fewer. Older men, women, and prisoners of war labored side by side, often without words. Fields still needed tending. Animals still needed feeding. Hunger did not pause for politics. Letters arrived irregularly, edges worn, sometimes censored, sometimes silent for weeks. A knock at the door could still mean news, and silence afterward carried its own weight. In kitchens, conversations shifted. What once had been spoken openly now moved carefully around unspoken edges. There was belief, yes. There was loyalty, fear, resignation, denial. Often all within the same person. Germany at war cannot be reduced to a single feeling. It was a mosaic of private realities held together by a system that demanded unity, even when inner worlds were fracturing. As the war turned, as cities burned and fronts collapsed, the atmosphere thickened. The confidence that had once filled rallies drained away into exhaustion. People listened less to speeches and more to rumors. They watched the sky. They counted losses quietly. And then came the end. Not as relief at first, but as shock. 1945 did not feel like peace arriving gently. It felt like silence after a storm that had stripped everything bare. Cities lay in ruins. Walls stood open to the weather. Streets were filled with dust, broken glass, and displaced lives. Hunger was constant. Cold lingered. Guilt, confusion, and disbelief settled slowly, like ash. Germany after the war was not immediately after. It was a long, slow standing up. Clearing rubble by hand, sharing scarce food, learning new rules, new borders, new truths. Trust had to be rebuilt, not only with the world, but within communities, families, even within oneself. Now, when we step forward into modern Germany, the contrast does not erase that struggle. It rests upon it. A modern German city at night is bright, open, and calm. Streetlights glow steadily. Cafes hum with low conversation. Public squares feel safe enough for children to run across without fear. There are no blackout curtains, no sirens practiced weekly. The sky is once again just the sky. This sense of stability did not appear by accident. It was constructed carefully, deliberately, with rules designed to prevent the concentration of unchecked power. Democracy here is not loud or dramatic. It is procedural, sometimes frustrating, often slow, and intentionally so. Schools teach history, not as distant tragedy, but as responsibility. Students visit former camps and memorials not to shock, but to understand. Questions are encouraged. Denial is not tolerated. Memory is treated as something alive, fragile, but necessary. In everyday life, the differences appear in subtle ways. Neighbors trust institutions rather than whispers. Disagreements are debated rather than enforced. National pride exists, but it is quiet, cautious, anchored to values rather than dominance. And yet, beneath all this modern calm, echoes remain. In the layout of streets rebuilt along old lines, in the names carved into stone, in the way silence is respected during moments of remembrance. Germany today does not rush past its past. It walks alongside it, aware of its weight. As you move gently through this story, notice how time layers rather than replaces. The same ground that once absorbed ruble now supports drumlines and cafes. The same rivers that carried wartime reflections now mirror neon lights and moonlit bridges. Germany, then and now, is not a story of forgetting. It is a story of learning how to live with memory without being consumed by it. And as we continue, we will step closer still into the inner lives of those who endured the war, and into the quiet confidence of those living today who inherit both the land and the lessons it carries forward into the night. Morning, during the war years, arrived without promise. It simply arrived. In industrial towns, factory whistles cut through the pale light before the sun had fully lifted itself above the roofs. Men and women moved through streets with lunch tins in hand, coats pulled tight, faces already composed into expressions of endurance. Inside the factories, machines thundered endlessly, a sound so constant it ceased to be noise and became atmosphere like wind or rain. Work was not only labor, it was obligation. The rhythm of production shaped time itself. Shifts blurred, days lost their names. Many workers no longer asked what the end product would become. Knowing too much was dangerous. Knowing too little was safer. Women filled roles, once denied to them, not as liberation, but as necessity. Their hands learned the weight of tools, the heat of metal, the discipline of repetition. At home, those same hands still prepared meals from shrinking rations, patched clothing, soothed children, and folded letters carefully, as though neatness might bring order to chaos. After the war, these same women would be called the Trümmerfrauen, the Ruble women, clearing destroyed cities stone by stone. There were no ceremonies at first, just dust, scraped knuckles, and quiet determination. Clearing rubble was not symbolic to them. It was practical. If life was to continue, space had to be made for it. Now, in modern Germany, work carries a different texture. Factories still exist, but they hum rather than roar. Automation has softened the strain. Safety is measured. Breaks are expected. Labor laws are discussed openly, negotiated, revised. Work is no longer framed as sacrifice for a greater cause, but as a balance between productivity and dignity. In town squares today, mornings are gentle. Bakeries open early, releasing warmth and the smell of bread into clean air. People greet one another without suspicion. Conversations are unhurried. There is space to pause. This is not because hardship vanished forever, but because systems were rebuilt to absorb it more humanely. During the war, information flowed in only one direction. Radio spoke with certainty, even when reality contradicted every word. Newspapers printed what was permitted. Silence became a form of communication, a raised eyebrow, a pause before answering, a change of subject. In contrast, modern Germany is saturated with information. News debates itself openly. Multiple perspectives exist side by side. Skepticism is encouraged rather than punished. The lesson learned was not that information is dangerous, but that controlled information is. The inner lives of people, then and now, reflect these differences deeply. A wartime German citizen often carried two selves, the public self and the private one. One knew what to say, the other knew what to think. This division created tension that followed people into sleep. Dreams were crowded with half-spoken thoughts. Today, the inner conflict is quieter, more philosophical. People argue about policy, identity, climate, economy, but they do so without the fear that disagreement alone could destroy their lives. The freedom to question has become ordinary, and therefore precious. Memory plays a unique role here. In Germany, remembrance is woven into daily space. Not grandly, but persistently. Small plaques. Preserved ruins. Silent memorials encountered unexpectedly during an ordinary walk. They do not demand attention. They wait for it. This approach shapes the national character subtly. Pride is restrained. Patriotism is cautious. Celebration exists, but rarely forgets. Context. Even joy has learned to coexist with responsibility. Compare this to the wartime years, when emotion was directed outward. Toward flags, rallies, slogans. Private doubt was buried beneath collective display. The contrast is not merely political, it is emotional architecture. During the war, children learned discipline early. Play was structured. Questions were guided. Education emphasized obedience and unity. Many grew up quickly, absorbing fear before they had words for it. Today's children grow up encouraged to question, to explore, to disagree respectfully. History lessons linger on the war not to shame, but to explain how ordinary lives became entangled in extraordinary harm. The comparison between then and now is not meant to flatter the present or condemn the past simplistically. It is meant to observe how choices repeated over decades reshape a society as emotional weather. Germany did not wake up one morning transformed. It practiced restraint. It practiced accountability. It practiced patience. As night returns in this story, imagine standing in the same place twice. Once in the 1940s, surrounded by darkness and uncertainty, and once now, beneath steady lights and open sky. The ground beneath your feet is the same. The air carries different expectations. History here is not a closed book. It is a companion, sometimes heavy, sometimes instructive, walking quietly beside those who move forward, step by careful step, into a future shaped by remembering rather than forgetting. And as we continue onward, we will drift deeper still into how Germany speaks to the world now, how it carries responsibility beyond its borders, and how the echoes of the past still guide its voice in the present, low and steady through the long night. Germany's voice, during the war, was loud on the outside and tightly guarded within. Marching songs carried across parade grounds. Orders traveled swiftly downward. Decisions were centralized, sharpened, and enforced. The state spoke in absolute's victory or defeat, loyalty or betrayal. There was little room between. For the individual, this created a peculiar stillness inside. Many learned to keep their inner world small and contained, like a room with the lights turned low. To feel too much, to question too openly, was exhausting and dangerous. Survival depended on reading the atmosphere accurately, knowing when to speak, when to nod, when to remain silent. As the war collapsed, that voice fractured. Millions were displaced. Families moved without knowing where they would land. Roads filled with carts, bicycles, people on foot carrying what could be held. Former soldiers returned to homes that no longer existed, or to silences where people had once waited. The authority that had spoken so loudly was suddenly gone, leaving behind a vacuum filled with hunger, shame, and uncertainty. In those years immediately after 1945, Germany did not yet have a clear voice of its own. It listened more than it spoke. Allied languages filled official spaces. New rules were learned slowly. Trust had to be reassembled piece by piece. This period of listening would shape everything that followed. Modern Germany speaks carefully, not because it lacks confidence, but because it understands the cost of unchecked certainty. In international spaces, its tone is measured, deliberate, often mediating rather than commanding. Power is exercised through structure, law, and cooperation rather than spectacle. The parliament building in Berlin, once damaged and divided by history, now stands transparent by design. Glass replaces stone in key places, not for beauty alone, but as symbolism. Government here is meant to be seen, questioned, held accountable. This is not accidental. It is architectural memory. Where wartime Germany sought dominance, modern Germany seeks integration. Where it once emphasized isolation and hierarchy, it now emphasizes partnership. The shift did not come from forgetting strength, but from redefining it. Strength, now, is restraint. In daily life, this philosophy appears quietly. Rules are followed not out of fear, but expectation. Public spaces are shared with consideration. Conflict is addressed through process rather than force. Even protests, common and accepted, unfold within agreed boundaries. Contrast this with the warriors. When public unity was enforced and private dissent hidden, the emotional labor required to live in such an environment was immense. It hollowed people out slowly, leaving behind fatigue that lingered long after the war ended. That fatigue was inherited, not genetically, but culturally. Many post-war generations grew up in homes where certain topics were avoided, where grandparents spoke little of what they had seen or done. Silence passed downward like an heirloom. Only later did questions begin to surface. Tentative at first, then insistent. Modern Germany has learned to speak into that silence. Archives were opened. Trials were held. Memorials were built. Education was reshaped. This was not a single moment of reckoning, but a prolonged process that continues even now. Responsibility is not treated as a debt to be paid once, but as an ongoing obligation. And yet, life is not lived in constant mourning. There is joy here. Festivals, music, football, summer evenings by rivers where laughter drifts easily through the air. The presence of memory does not suffocate these moments. It grounds them. It reminds people that normalcy is precious precisely because it was once destroyed. During the war, joy was fragile and often private. A shared joke whispered in a factory, a stolen moment of music played softly behind closed doors. Happiness had to hide. Now, happiness is allowed to exist openly, without suspicion. As night deepens again in our story, imagine the difference in sound. Wartime nights carried engines, sirens, distant impacts. Modern nights carry bicycles passing, glasses clinking, low conversation floating upward from cafes. The same streets, the same bricks. In some places, entirely different expectations. Germany's transformation was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate choices made repeatedly, often slowly, often imperfectly. Choices to listen, to remember, to build systems that assume fallibility rather than perfection. As we continue onward, we will drift further inward, into the quiet moral landscape that emerged from the ruins. We will explore how guilt, responsibility, and humility shaped not only laws and borders, but the everyday way people move through the world now. For the story is not only about what Germany did or what happened to it, it is about how a society learned over generations to walk more gently across its own history, carrying the weight of the past without letting it crush the present. As the long night slowly carries us forward, guilt does not arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like cold through stone. For many Germans after the war, the first sensation was not moral reckoning, but exhaustion. Bodies within. Minds were dulled by survival. The question why came later. Once there was enough food to think beyond the next day, only then did memory begin to press more insistently against the walls of everyday life. At first, memory appeared in fragments. A photograph tucked into a drawer. A name spoken and then quickly dismissed. A train whistle heard in the distance that carried something heavier than sound. People learned, unconsciously, which thoughts could be tolerated and which were pushed aside. Homes were rebuilt, but conversations often were not. Children born after the war grew up in rooms shaped by absence. Fathers who did not speak much. Mothers who worked tirelessly, rarely resting. Questions were answered briefly, or not at all. The past hovered like fog, visible, but never fully addressed. And yet, time has a way of asking questions even when people do not. By the late decades of the 20th century, Germany began to turn toward its own silence. Younger generations asked what had happened, and why. Schools changed their language. Museums changed their tone. The war was no longer something that had simply ended. It was something that had to be understood. Memory moved from private burden to public responsibility. This is where modern Germany becomes distinct. Rather than sealing history away, it embedded it into the landscape. The small brass stolperstein stumbling stones appeared unexpectedly beneath one's feet, engraved with names, dates, and fates. They do not shout. They interrupt gently, forcing a pause. a moment of recognition during an otherwise ordinary walk. The message is quiet but persistent. This happened here. During the war, place was often abstract. Orders came from elsewhere. Consequences felt distant, until suddenly they were not. Today, memory is localized. It belongs to streets, buildings, schools, homes. Responsibility is not abstract. It is groomed. This shapes behavior in subtle ways. Discussions about power are cautious. Language is examined carefully. Extremes raise alarms quickly. Democracy is protected not with celebration, but with vigilance. When tensions rise, there is a collective memory of where unchallenged momentum can lead. Contrast this with the wartime years, when momentum was everything. Speed was praised. Hesitation was condemned. Reflection was seen as weakness. The machine moved forward relentlessly, and individuals were carried with it, whether they wished to be or not. Now, slowness is valued. Decisions take time. Consensus is sought. Debate is expected. This frustrates some, but it is intentional. Germany learned that speed, when coupled with certainty, can be dangerous. In classrooms today, students sit with uncomfortable truths. They learn how ordinary systems enabled extraordinary harm. They study not only leaders, but neighbors, clerks, teachers, people, much like themselves. The lesson is not that evil is rare, but that it can become normal if left unexamined. This education does not aim to paralyze with shame. It aims to sharpen awareness. Daily life reflects this sharpened consciousness. Small acts of fairness matter. Rules exist to protect the vulnerable. There is an underlying assumption that society must be designed with human weakness in mind, not idealized virtue. During the war, weakness was hidden or punished. Strength was performed loudly. Today, strength is quieter, found in transparency, restraint, and the willingness to admit error. As evening settles again in our story, imagine two families at dinner, decades apart. In the 1940s, the table is sparse. Conversation is cautious. A radio hums in the background, filling silences with approved words. No one speaks too freely. The future feels narrow. In the present day, the table is fuller. Conversation wanders. Disagreement is allowed. Phones lie face. History may come up, not as accusation, but as context. The future feels open, though never taken for granted. These differences are not cosmetic. They are the result of long, deliberate moral labor. Germany's relationship with its past is not comfortable, but it is honest. An honesty, practiced over time, reshapes a society's posture, how it stands, how it listens, how it responds to the world. As we continue drifting forward, the night still holding us gently, we will look next at how this inward transformation influenced Germany. Its outward role, how a country once defined by expansion, learned instead to define itself by responsibility, cooperation, and a careful guardianship of peace. The story flows on, unhurried, carrying us deeper into the long, quiet aftershadows of history, where understanding grows not from forgetting, but from staying present with what remains. History does not always pass through generations as stories. Often, it passes as posture. A way of sitting at the table, a hesitation before certain words, an instinct to double-check, to ask permission, to wait. In many German homes, the legacy of the war lingered not in explanations, but in atmosphere. Children noticed that some topics made the room grow still, that some questions received answers that were technically complete, yet emotionally distant. T-learned, without being told where the edges were. A grandfather polishing the same tool again and again. A grandmother who saved string, jars, buttons, anything that might one day be useful. A reluctance to waste, to boast, to assume tomorrow would be easy. These habits were not taught as lessons. They were simply lived. During the war, uncertainty ruled daily life. Nothing could be assumed. Food might vanish. Homes might disappear. Authority might change overnight. That uncertainty carved grooves into behavior, and even when conditions improved, the grooves remained. Today, in modern Germany, you can still feel traces of this inheritance. People plan carefully. Rules matter. Preparedness is respected. There is comfort in structure. Not because creativity is feared, but because chaos is remembered, even by those who never experienced it directly. At the same time, there was a quiet effort to soften what was once rigid. You can see it in parenting styles that emphasize listening, in workplaces that value consensus over command, in a cultural appreciation for balance between work and rest, freedom and responsibility, expression and restraint. This balancing act did not emerge spontaneously. It is the slow correction of an older imbalance. During the war, identity was flattened. Individual difference was dangerous. Belonging required conformity, visible and vocal. Today, difference is normalized. Not always perfectly accepted, not without tension, but no longer something to be erased. Cities reflect this shift. Where once uniformity dominated, now diversity moves through streets. Easily. Languages mix. Foods, travel, traditions overlap. Germany's modern identity is less about defining who belongs and more about managing how belonging works in practice. This, too, is shaped by memory. The war taught that exclusion, once normalized, accelerates quickly. Lines drawn around us and them harden faster than expected. Modern Germany is sensitive to these early stages, sometimes overly cautious, sometimes hesitant, but always aware. In the evenings, when daily noise fades, these long arcs of history settle into quieter forms. A person locks their bicycle carefully, not because danger feels imminent, but because order feels respectful. A train arrives precisely on time, and no one applauds. It is simply how things should work. A public debate grows heated, then cools, then continues another day. Normality, here, is actively maintained. Compare this with wartime nights. Then, darkness meant vulnerability. Silence meant danger or dread. The future narrowed into hours rather than years. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, alert. Now, night is allowed to be restorative again. Windows glow softly. Curtains remain open. People sleep without rehearsing emergency routines. The sky holds no threat. This peace is not dramatic, and that is its triumph. Germany's transformation did not erase its scars. It taught the society how to live with them without letting them define every step. Scars are acknowledged, protected, but no longer worshipped or hidden. As generations pass, memory changes texture. Those who lived the war are fewer now. Their memories, once urgent and personal, have become historical, but not distant. Institutions carry what individuals no longer can. Rituals replace recollections. Education replaces testimony. This transition is delicate. Forgetting is easy. Remembering responsibly requires effort. Germany continues to choose effort. In doing so, it models something unusual. A national identity that includes limitation. An understanding that power must be held lightly. That pride must be balanced by reflection. That freedom, without care, can become careless. As the night deepens further, the story itself grows quieter, not thinner, deeper. We are no longer moving through events, but through the residue they left behind. The emotional sediment that shapes choices long after headlines fade. In this stillness, the comparison between then and now becomes less about contrast and more about continuity. How one era teaches the next what to avoid, what to protect, what to hold gently. Germany, once driven by momentum, now practices pause. And in that pause, there is room for ordinary lives to unfold without fear. For children to sleep through the night. For conversations to wander freely. For the future to remain open rather than prescribed. The night carries on, unbroken. And as we drift forward together, the story will continue to soften, not because its meaning diminishes, but because understanding, once earned, does not need to shout. It only needs to remain present, beyond the cities, beyond the debates and memorials. Germany stretches outward into fields, forests, and small towns where history feels slower, heavier, and closer to the ground. During the war, these places were often imagined as untouched, peaceful pockets away from the noise of cities and politics. But the war reached them too, quietly, persistently. Young men left and did not return. Refugees arrived unexpectedly, carrying stories they rarely shared. Barns stored grain that was requisite. Churches rang bells for losses that accumulated faster than names could be read aloud. Villages learned to absorb absence. A chair remained empty at the table. A name remained unspoken. A path went untrodden. After the war, these places rebuilt without spectacle. Rubble was cleared. Roofs were patched. Fields were replanted. There were no grand speeches in village squares, only work, repetition, endurance. The land itself demanded continuity. Seasons arrived whether people were ready or not. Today, in those same countryside spaces, time feels generous again. Trains pass through rolling landscapes with steady rhythm. Cows graze without urgency. Church bells mark hours, rather than losses. The silence here is not ominous. Edie's rest, and yet, memory lingers differently in these places. It is carried by last names repeated across mailboxes, by family stories that begin vaguely during the war, and then trail off, by buildings that were repaired rather than replaced, their walls slightly uneven, holding stories beneath fresh paint. In the city's history is curated. In the countryside, it is lived with. This dual relationship shapes Germany's overall temperament. The country balances reflection with routine, remembrance with practicality. There is an understanding that life must continue even while memory is honored, that tending a garden can coexist with acknowledging grief. During the war, continuity was often enforced artificially. The appearance of normality was maintained even as reality fractured beneath it. Today, continuity is organic. It emerges from trust that tomorrow will resemble today, closely enough to plan for it. This trust is fragile. Germany knows this. That knowledge does not create fear. It creates care. In small towns, community meetings are well attended. Local decisions are discussed thoroughly. Change happens slowly, often deliberately. Progress is not resisted, but it is examined. The past taught that rapid transformation, unexamined, carries risks. Compare this with the wartime years, when change was abrupt, absolute, and imposed. Overnight, rules shifted, neighbors disappeared. Allegiances were demanded immediately. There was no time to adjust, only to comply. Now, adjustment is built into the system. If something fails, it is analyzed. If harm occurs, responsibility is traced. This does not eliminate mistakes, but it prevents denial from becoming policy. As evening settles, once more, imagine a train window reflecting both darkness outside and a faint image of the passenger within. This reflection mirrors Germany's relationship with its history, always seeing itself alongside what has come before. The journey continues forward, but never without glancing back. Germany's story, then and now, is not a straight line from darkness to light. It is a winding path, shaped by careful steps, pauses, and occasional stumbles. What matters is not perfection, but attention. Attention to language, attention to power, attention to the ordinary moments where values are practiced quietly. As the night deepens further, the pace of the story slows again. There is less movement, now, more stillness, less contrast, more integration. We are approaching the place where comparison softens into coexistence, where past and present are no longer opposing images, but layers of the same landscape, visible at once if you look gently enough. Stay here in this quiet for a moment. Listen to the distant train. Feel the steady ground beneath your feet. Notice how nothing urgent is required of you now. The story has not ended. It is simply resting, gathering breath, before drifting onward into the final, gentler currents of understanding, where history no longer presses forward, but settles beside us, like a companion walking quietly through the dark. The story, at this hour, does not move forward so much as it breathes. Germany, having learned to live with its past, now carries it the way one carries a familiar weight. Not always consciously, but never without awareness. The past no longer demands attention at every step, yet it shapes posture, pace, and balance. In the quietest hours of night, when even memory seems to rest, you can feel this balance most clearly. A single light in an apartment window, a tram gliding through wet streets, reflections trembling briefly, tense, someone awake, late, reading, not because they must, but because they can. During the war, wakefulness at night often meant vigilance. Listening, waiting, measuring distance and danger. Sleep was interrupted not by choice, but by necessity. The body learned to rest lightly, never fully letting go. Now, wakefulness is softer, optional, a space for thought, rather than survival. These differences, subtle, almost invisible, may be the most profound transformation of all. The Germany of the war years existed in a permanent state of urgency. Everything mattered immediately. Everything demanded alignment. The future was imagined as something to be seized or secured, not inhabited. The Germany of today lives in duration. It plans decades ahead. It argues patiently. It accepts that not every problem has a clean resolution. Time is no longer an enemy to outrun or dominate, but a medium to move within. This change reshaped how people relate to one another. Trust, once fractured, is now built slowly, through reliability rather than rhetoric. Institutions earn confidence, not by grandeur, but by consistency. Promises are modest. Expectations are grounded. Where wartime life compressed existence into survival, modern life allows expansion, inward as much as outward. People are permitted to be contradictory, to hold opinions that evolve, to change their minds publicly without fear of erasure. This flexibility, so ordinary now, was once unthinkable. And yet, the past does not vanish simply because it is integrated. Certain days remain heavier than others. Certain anniversaries quiet the country. Flags lower, bells ring, names are read aloud. Silence is shared, not imposed, but chosen. This shared silence is different from the enforced silence of the war. Then, silence was fear. Now, silence is respect. The distinction matters. As the night deepens further, the story begins its long descent towards stillness. There are no more contrasts to sharpen, no more lessons to underline. What remains is texture. The feel of a society that has learned to carry complexity without collapsing under it. Germany, then and now, exists not as a moral arc completed, but as a practice ongoing. A practice of remembering without fixation, of acting without arrogance, of living without the illusion of purity or finality. In this practice, there is humility. Humility not as weakness, but as orientation, a way of standing in the world that leaves room for others, for doubt, for correction. This humility permeates the ordinary. A pedestrian waits patiently at a crossing, even when the street is empty. A disagreement pauses to consider context. A law is debated not for victory, but for consequence. These small gestures, repeated millions of times, are the quiet architecture of peace. As you rest here, listening to the story slow itself into near stillness, notice how the urgency has faded. There is no climax ahead, no final revelation waiting to be unveiled. There is only continuity. The same land that once echoed with marching feet now carries bicycles and footsteps without fear. The same cities that once burned now glow softly at night. The same language that once commanded now negotiates, questions, and reflects. Germany did not escape its history. It chose to remain in conversation with it. And that conversation, unlike war, does not end. It softens. It deepens. It becomes part of the background hum of daily life. Present, but no longer overwhelming. The night holds this hum gently. And as the story continues to drift slower now, quieter, there's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to decide. You can simply remain here in the calm space where past and present no longer compete, but rest side by side like two chapters of the same long book lying open under dim light, waiting patiently to be read again, or to be set down, peacefully, as sleep takes over and the world continues, steady and unafraid, into another ordinary morning. Before morning fully arrives, there is a narrow hour when the world feels undecided. Germany knows this hour well. It is the moment just before the first tram hums awake, when the sky lightens without color, when streets are neither night nor day. In this suspended time, history feels closest, not as memory, but as presence, as if all the years are layered thinly enough to sense at once. During the war, Dawn carried tension. It revealed what the night had done. New damage. New absences. Smoke still rising where something had stood hours before. People stepped outside cautiously, scanning familiar streets for unfamiliar gaps. Dawn asked questions no one wanted to answer. Today, dawn is gentler. Streets reappear intact. Windows glow one by one. Bakeries unlock their doors. The day begins not with reckoning, but with routine. This difference is so ordinary now that it rarely draws attention, which is precisely what makes it remarkable. Peace, sustained long enough, becomes invisible. Germany's post-war generations grew up inside this invisibility. For them, war exists first, a story, then a study, then as responsibility. They inherit not the fear itself, but the obligation to understand why it must not return. This inheritance is quiet, but it is constant. In universities, students debate ethics late into the night. In offices, decisions are weighed carefully. In public discourse, language is examined for its implications. These are not dramatic acts. They are habits. Habits shaped by a past that demonstrated what happens when habits fail. During the war, many destructive actions were not driven by cruelty alone, but by normalization. Each step, taken in isolation, seemed manageable. Each compromise felt temporary. The machinery advanced not because everyone pushed enthusiastically, but because enough people did not resist early enough. Modern Germany has internalized this lesson deeply. There is a collective sensitivity to thresholds. Moments when something small might become something irreversible. This does not create panic. It creates attentiveness. Attentiveness shows itself in subtle ways. A policy proposal is scrutinized, not only for efficiency, but for precedent. The public figure's words are examined, not just for intent, but for resonance. A movement is questioned not only for what it promises, but for what it excludes. This level of attention can feel heavy at times. It slows progress. It frustrates those who crave certainty and speed. But it is precisely this slowness that acts as safeguard. Germany learned that momentum, once unchecked, is difficult to stop. As the sun rises higher now in our story, light settles evenly across buildings old and new. There is no need to hide windows. No reason to fear visibility. Transparency, once dangerous, is now expected. Glass architecture reflects this shift. Open records. Public accountability, processes that leave traces rather than erase them. Where the wartime state thrived on obscurity and command, the modern state relies on clarity and consent. Authority is fragmented intentionally. Power is distributed, not concentrated. This design does not eliminate conflict. It contains Italiano and containment. Here is not suppression. It is structure channels through which disagreement can move without becoming destructive. In everyday life, this means that tension does not immediately feel existential. People argue fiercely about policy, culture, direction, and then return to ordinary routines. The stakes are high, but not absolute. During the war, every disagreement was framed as survival. There was no neutral ground. Everything was urgent. Everything demanded alignment. Now, alignment is negotiated, not enforced. As morning fully arrives, imagine commuters moving through stations. Faces neutral, focused, unafraid. The machinery of daily life resumes quietly, efficiently. This machinery exists not to dominate, but to support. And beneath it all lies an unspoken understanding that systems matter because people are fallible. Germany no longer builds its identity on idealized strength. It builds on managed imperfection, on the assumption that safeguards are necessary because no society is immune to error. This is the long lesson of its 20th century. As we move forward together, the story does not escalate. It continues to decelerate, settling into a rhythm meant not to instruct, but to accompany. We have moved from destruction to reconstruction, from certainty to doubt, from command to conversation. What remains now is not resolution, but steadiness. The kind of steadiness that allows a country to wake each morning without rehearsing catastrophe. The kind that allows history to inform rather than dominate. The kind that makes ordinary days possible. And so the light rises fully now, washing over streets that once knew darkness too well. The story continues, not toward an ending, but into continuation itself. where Germany, then and now, exists not as contrast, but as continuity shaped by care, moving gently forward through time, carrying memory not as burden, but as guidance, as the day unfolds quietly and the night finally loosens its hold. As the morning settles in fully, the world resumes without ceremony. Cups are set down on cafe tables, chairs scrape softly against stone. Newspapers unfold, their pages thin and familiar. In these small sounds, Germany's present life continues, not triumphantly, not unceasingly, simply steadily. This steadiness is not accidental. It is cultivated. During the war, mornings were consumed by directives. Orders arrived early, shaping the day before it had a chance to unfold. People learned to move according to external rhythms, whistles, announcements, schedules imposed from above. Personal intention mattered less than compliance. Now, intention has returned to the individual. A person chooses when to leave home, what to read, where to walk. These choices seem insignificant, but they are the texture of freedom. They are the opposite of command. In classrooms, students gather without uniforms, without salutes. History lessons do not rush. They linger. Teachers encourage questions that have no easy answers. Silence is allowed, not as control, but as space for thought. The children sitting there are far removed from the war years, yet they inherit their consequences. They are taught not what to think, but how fragile thinking can be when surrendered too easily. This is one of the quiet revolutions of modern Germany. During the war, education narrowed perspective. It simplified the world into absolutes. Today, education widens it deliberately, insisting on complexity, contradiction, and context. Certainty is treated cautiously. Curiosity is valued. In parks and public spaces, this philosophy continues invisibly. People share space with ease. There is an unspoken agreement, not perfection, but cooperation. Dogs wait at crossings. Cyclists yield. Pedestrians pause! These are small acts, but they accumulate into atmosphere. During the war, public space was ideological. It belonged to the state. It was monitored, choreographed, symbolic. Today, it belongs to the everyday. It is functional, lived in, unremarkable, and therefore precious. Memory, still present, does not interrupt these routines. It underlines them. A memorial stands quietly at the edge of a park, visited not daily, but reliably. A plaque on a school wall reminds, without overwhelming. These markers do not demand attention. They wait, patiently, for those ready to notice. This patience is new. In wartime Germany, everything demanded immediacy, loyalty, action, response. There was no room for waiting. Waiting meant doubt. Doubt meant danger. Now, waiting is acceptable. Reflection is respected. Decisions are allowed to mature. This change reshapes emotional life. People are less driven by fear of misalignment and more by a desire for coherence between values and actions. Memory and movement. Life is no longer lived under the assumption that catastrophe is imminent, but under the understanding that it is possible if neglected. This distinction matters. As the day progresses, the story itself begins to loosen further. There is no urgency pulling us forward. We have arrived at a place where past and present are no longer in opposition, but in dialogue, sometimes quiet, sometimes difficult, always ongoing. Germany's transformation cannot be measured only in laws or alliances. It is measured in tone, in how loudly people speak, in how often they listen, in how rarely power needs to raise its voice. During the war, power shouted it had to. It was insecure beneath its certainty. Now, power speaks calmly, knowing it must justify itself continuously. This calm is not apathy. It is vigilance without panic. And so, as afternoon approaches in our long journey, the light remains steady. Shadows exist, but they do not dominate. The story has become what it was always moving toward. Not a conclusion, but a sustained state of balance. Germany, then and now, is no longer a warning frozen in time, nor a redemption story neatly completed. It is a living example of what happens when a society chooses, repeatedly, to slow down where it once rushed, to question where it once obeyed, to remember where it once erased. There is nothing left to prove here, only something to maintain. And maintenance, like peace, is quiet work. So we remain here a while longer in the gentle continuity of ordinary hours, where history no longer presses from behind, nor pulls urgently from ahead, but walks alongside, atan evan passi. As the day unfolds calmly, and the story continues, not toward an ending, but toward rest, deeper and deeper, until even the need to understand softens, and presence itself becomes enough. Be afternoon. The day has found its balance. The urgency of morning has passed, and the anticipation of evening has not yet arrived. This middle hour is where Germany now lives most comfortably in the space between extremes, where nothing needs to prove itself. Libraries breathe quietly. Pages turn. Footsteps soften instinctively, as though people understand without instruction that concentration is a shared resource. In these rooms, knowledge is not weaponized. It is tended. During the war, knowledge was narrowed deliberately. Information was trimmed to fit purpose. Questions that wandered too far were redirected or silenced. Thinking was guided along approved paths, and curiosity, when it strayed, became dangerous. Now, curiosity is protected. Archives are open. Records are accessible. Students and historians alike can trace decisions, follow consequences, uncover uncomfortable truths. There is no illusion that transparency erases harm, only the belief that concealment multiplies it. This belief runs quietly through modern life. In workplaces, decisions are documented. In governance procedures, leave trails. Even mistakes are recorded, examined, corrected publicly when possible. The goal is not perfection, but traceability. The ability to look back and understand how something came to be. This is one of the deepest contrasts between then and now. Wartime Germany erased its own footprints as it moved forward, rewriting narratives as needed. Modern Germany leaves footprints intentionally, accepting that being seen is part of accountability. As afternoon light slants across streets and parks, people pause without guilt. Sitting on benches, watching children play, listening to birds settle briefly before taking flight again. There is permission here to exist without purpose. During the war, idleness was suspect. Every moment was expected to serve the collective drive. Rest was rationed. Stillness felt dangerous, as though inactivity itself might signal disloyalty. Now, stillness is ordinary. This ordinariness is the quiet victory of peace. Germany's relationship with time has changed profoundly. Time is no longer something to be conquered or accelerated. It is allowed to stretch, to slow, to accommodate uncertainty. In conversations, pauses are no longer alarming. Silence can mean thought rather than fear. Disagreement does not require immediate resolution. People can leave questions open and return to them later. This openness was once impossible. As the afternoon deepens, the story itself becomes less narrative and more presence. We are no longer moving through comparisons, but inhabiting the space they created. The Germany of the warriors feels distant now, not because it has been forgotten, but because it no longer dictates the rhythm of the present. Its lessons have been absorbed into habits, structures, instincts. Memory has become muscle memory, a reflex to question authority, a reflex to value process, a reflex to protect the ordinary. These reflexes are quiet, but they are strong. As shadows lengthen, the day begins to lean toward evening again. The cycle continues, not dramatically, not urgently, but reliably. Germany has learned to trust this reliability, and in that trust, the story finds its calmest register yet. There is nothing left to explain, nothing left to contrast sharply. What remains is a gentle coexistence of past and present, not as rivals, but as ledgers. Layers of stone beneath streets, layers of memory beneath language, layers of caution beneath confidence. The country moves forward not by forgetting where it has been, but by refusing to rush away from it. And so as the light softens and the long arc of the day bends toward rest, we remain. Here in the sustained quiet of a society that has learned slowly and painfully how to live without shouting, how to remember without drowning, how to move without marching. The story does not end. It simply continues. Gently, steadily. Like footsteps that no longer echo with fear, but blend into the ordinary sounds of life, carrying us onward, unhurried, into the approaching calm of evening once more. As evening approaches again, the light changes its tone. It becomes warmer, slower, as though the day itself is learning how to let go. Germany, in this hour, feels most at ease, not striving forward, not looking back too sharply, simply existing within the present it has worked so carefully to shape. Shops begin to close without haste. Conversations soften. Windows are opened just enough to let air move through rooms. The day exhales. During the war, evening often brought unease. Darkness meant uncertainty. The coming night carried unanswered questions. People prepared themselves mentally, physically, for interruption. Supper was eaten quickly. Lights were checked. Silence was practiced. Now, evening is permissive. Meals stretch longer. Voices drift outward without fear. The night is anticipated rather than endured. There is no rehearsal for emergency. No listening for distant engines. The sky darkens because it always has, not because something might come from it. This return of trust in night is one of the quietest, deepest transformations. Germany once lived with the sense that time itself was hostile, that tomorrow might demand everything without warning. Today, time is neutral again. It carries no threat by itself. It can be filled or left empty. In apartments, families move through familiar rituals. Dishes was said, tables cleared. Someone waters a plant on the balcony, careful not to spill onto the street below. These gestures are small, but they are uninterrupted, and interruption is what once defined life. Memory, even here, does not intrude loudly. It exists instead as a background awareness. The reason certain words are chosen carefully, certain jokes avoided, certain symbols treated with restraint, it does not darken the room, it steadies Italiano. This steadiness is the result of long effort. Germany did not heal by replacing one certainty with another. It healed by accepting uncertainty as permanent and designing a life that can hold it without breaking. That acceptance shows itself most clearly at day's end. People allow themselves to rest without suspicion. They do not equate calm with complacency, nor vigilance with fear. Both are present, balanced. As twilight settles fully, streets glow softly. Lamps come on one by one. Reflections appear in windows, in rivers, in polished stone. The world doubles itself, briefly inside and outside, past and present. In these reflections, the comparison between then and now becomes almost unnecessary. The difference is no longer something to be explained. It is something to be felt. The war years were sharp-edged, compressed, loud inside the mind even when outwardly silent. The present is rounded, spacious, breathable, not perfect, never perfect, but humane. Germany learned, over decades, that humanity is not something declared. It is something practiced in routines, in patience, in the refusal to simplify what must remain complex. And so the evening deepens gently. There is no conclusion waiting, no final image to hold on to, only continuity. The slow, steady movement of ordinary life sustained by care, memory, and restraint. You can rest here. The story will keep moving, even when you stop listening. Streets will darken and brighten again. People will wake and sleep without fear. History will remain, not as threat, but as quiet counsel. And in this calm, Germany, then and now, is no longer a contrast to be measured, but a landscape to drift through, slowly, as the night settles fully, and the long work of peace continues in silence, one unremarkable evening at a time. Night arrives fully now, without drama. It does not descend, the way it once did, sudden, threatening, filled with anticipation. It settles instead, evenly, like a blanket laid carefully across the city. Windows glow in clusters. Footsteps thin out. The rhythm of the day slows until it is almost imperceptible. Germany at night has learned how to be quiet again. During the war, quiet was never empty. It was crowded with listening. People listened for engines, for boots on stairs, for knocks that might change everything. Silence was heavy with expectation. Even rest carried tension, as though sleep itself were a risk. Now, quiet is allowed to be what it is. A pause. A rest. A rest. A letting go. In bedrooms, people read until their eyes grow tired. Lamps are switched off without checking the sky. Doors are locked out of habit, not fear. Sleep comes gradually, without rehearsal. This ease did not arrive suddenly. It was practiced, night after night, year after year, until the body itself learned what safety feels like. Germany's transformation can be traced through these bodily memories as much as through laws or borders. Muscles that once stayed tense at rest slowly softened. Breaths that once stayed shallow grew deeper. Time, once rationed, became abundant again. The war taught the body vigilance. Peace had to teach it trust. In the long aftermath, many carried vigilance with them, even into calm decades. A sensitivity to noise. A startled response that lingered, a habit of preparing for what might go wrong. These were not failures of healing. They were residues of survival. Over generations, these residues thinned. Children born into peace absorbed different cues. They learned that night meant rest, not readiness. That darkness could be gentle. That tomorrow would likely arrive. This inheritance, the inheritance of calm, may be the most valuable one Germany now holds. Outside, streets lie open and empty. The architecture of cities reveals itself differently at night. Buildings stand without purpose, without crowd or function, simply existing. Facades once scarred by war now hold only the memory of repair, not the wound itself. In some places, scars remain intentionally visible. A wall left unrepaired. A line traced through stone. These are not accusations. They are acknowledgments. Germany does not erase reminders of what it has endured and caused. It places them carefully, so they do not overwhelm, but do not disappear. This careful placement mirrors the larger philosophy of the present. Nothing is absolute. Nothing is forgotten. Nothing is allowed to dominate entirely. As the night deepens further, the city's sounds reduce to essentials. A distant train, a door closing softly, the low hum of electricity. These are the sounds of infrastructure doing its quiet work, supporting life without demanding attention. During the war, infrastructure was loud. It announced itself. It commanded. It moved people whether they wished to move or not. Today, infrastructure recedes. It serves service rather than spectacle, defines strength now. Germany's modern identity rests on this inversion. Where once power asserted itself visibly and relentlessly, now it is measured by how little it intrudes. The best systems are those that go unnoticed because they work. In peace resembles night more than day. It is not bright or dramatic. It is steady, predictable, and easily taken for granted. That it is not taken for granted, here is the result of memory. Memory woven so deeply into habit that it rarely needs to surface explicitly. People do not walk around thinking of war constantly. They do not carry guilt like a weight in their hands. Instead, they carry awareness like posture. Subtle, shaping movement. Without conscious effort, this posture influences how Germany responds when the world grows uncertain again, as it inevitably does. Crises arise. Tensions surface. Fear attempts to return. But the reflex is different now. The reflex is to slow down, to consult, to question, to resist the pull of urgency when urgency demands obedience. This reflex was learned painfully. It is maintained quietly. As midnight approaches in our long story, the narrative itself thins further. There is less to say because less needs to be said. Understanding has moved from explanation into atmosphere. We are no longer walking through history. We are resting within its outcome. Germany, then and now, exists not as a lesson completed, but as a practice sustained night after night, decision after decision, generation after generation. The warriors are not sealed off behind glass. They live on as caution, as humility, as restraint. The present does not shine brighter because the past was dark. It shines because it learned how not to blind itself. And so the night continues. Somewhere, A final light clicks off. Somewhere, someone turns over in sleep without waking fully. Somewhere, history rests, not forgotten, not feared, simply present, like a shadow that no longer frightens, because it no longer moves on its own. You can rest here. There's nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to defend against. Only the long, gentle continuity of a world that has learned slowly, imperfectly, how to remain calm after the storm. As the night holds everything softly, and the story drifts on, unbroken, into quiet.